Specialized Turbo Levo. This is a really fun bike. Overall, I've really enjoyed it, but to keep myself from, rambling too much, we're gonna break this down into a few different sections and walk you through my thoughts on the bike and my experience riding it so far. Shout out to the guys at Lostco. This is a locally owned bike shop up in Bellingham, Washington. I'll put a link down below for the Lostco. I do have some upgrades on this bike, which I'll cover in future videos. If you want to like and subscribe, you can follow along with those. You'll probably have a good idea of what those might be after watching this video all the way through. If you're interested, follow along. All right, first we're gonna look at the geometry, the specs there, how they lay out, and if there's anything I would change. Next, we'll go through the components, kind of the same thing. What are the components that were spec'd on this bike? How did they fare with my riding? How do I feel they kind of stack up with other things? And where do I feel there's some room for improvement? Lastly, we're gonna take a look just at the e-bike specific components, which are basically the battery and the motor and some of the display and things like that. Okay, the first thing to note on the geometry or kind of the layout of this bike, it's a mixed wheel mountain bike or a mullet mountain bike, which means we've got a bigger wheel in the front and a smaller wheel in the back. Business in the front, party in the back. But anyway, the idea with that is to shorten the back end and make it feel a little more playful, like you can move the back end around, although you still maintain that ability to kind of monster truck over things with the big 29er front tire. This also is helpful when you're riding steep terrain, like a lot of the trails here in the Pacific Northwest. Now on the medium, I always look at the medium or the S5 here. We have a 477 millimeter reach. For me, riding S5, I have a 502 millimeter reach here. For some comparison, my extra large transition Spire is a 510 millimeter reach. I can't say I noticed this change drastically in terms of the overall stability and tracking of the bike, but I have noticed over time the bike feeling kind of more nimble overall, especially quick repeated turns, and then also I would say the ability to lean the bike over and kind of have some more body bike separation. I don't know if that's just because it's lighter overall, or if it's just easier to lean a 27.5. There's a lot of different physics you could get into with, how the wheels want to continue to go forward as they're spinning and not tip, but I'm not qualified to talk about that. The interesting thing about it is that in some ways I almost felt like this bike was lighter than the Spire. It's obviously heavier by about 10 pounds, but there are times on a trail when we're going fast enough that I felt like I could actually maneuver the Levo a little bit more easily than I could maneuver the Spire. Specifically, it was kind of taking that back end wheel and moving it and placing it, as well as, like I said, leaning into turns. The next thing, before we kind of move on to the back of the bike, we're gonna look at the front and look at the angles. So the angles of the head tube and then the angles of the seat tube. The head tube angle is 64.5 degrees. 64.5 degrees overall in terms of, we're looking at, broad spectrum of bikes. It's pretty slack. It's, I would say, fairly in the middle or the aggressive range of like enduro bikes. So this is definitely an enduro geometry. 76.2 seat tube angle. I prefer around a 75 plus seat tube angle when we're talking enduro or more downhill oriented or aggressive trail bike, down country, whatever you want to say there, but the line between enduro and trail bike. Now as we can continue to move towards the back of the bike, the chainstay length here is 442 millimeters. I'd say this is right around the standard ish for enduro bikes, maybe slightly on the shorter end. It's not a shrunken chainstay just because it's a mullet. It is, kind of a more standard chainstay. Overall, the setup of the geometry and the way it feels riding it actually does take away some of that feeling of it being an e-bike. It feels a little more lively and playful, even though it is a heavier bike, and you'd get that, planted feeling that everyone refers to when they're talking about e-bikes. All right, let's move on to the components here. We'll start off with the tires. This has Specialized tires set up on here. Obviously 29 in the front, 27.5 in the back, both 2.6s. We have the Butcher in the front, the Eliminator in the rear. Very aggressive tire names. They're Specialized. They're 2.6s, so they're pretty big, which is probably reducing some or taking away from rolling speed somewhat. What I have to say overall about these tires is they're basically middle of the road in every aspect. They're not great at anything. They're also not terrible at anything. Not a super tacky compound, but it has pretty good grip on roots. Could be better. It doesn't have massive side knobs, so you don't have that like this really grips in wet conditions or muddy conditions. In the positive, it grips pretty well in all situations. It does also pack mud in a kind of moderate level. So basically, this is not a ringing endorsement, but it's also not like dying to take them off my bike right away. They're just okay. Overall, I'd just say they're kind of meh. All right, let's talk brakes. Sram G2 brakes on here, 203 rotor up front, and then a 180 millimeter rotor in the back. Now I know I might get hate for this, but I actually don't dislike Sram brakes that much. And G2s are pretty powerful. I like the lever feel. We don't have a bite point adjustment. We do have just the lever adjustment there. They're not bad. Like, they're not bad brakes. I have quite a bit of stopping power with the 203 rotor up front. I feel fine with them. I don't feel like they're a piece of the bike or component of the bike that I really need to replace. But I do understand that some people just don't like them. For me, they're fine. And with the added weight of the e-bike, I still feel like I have plenty of stopping power with them. All right, the suspension is next. Let's start up front with the fork. We have a Rockshox 35 silver air fork. This is a part of the bike that I really felt like was going to be the first one to get kind of maxed out by what I was riding the bike on, and it was basically true. Any spot that you had repeated hits or really chunky terrain, I either felt like it was kind of overmatched and not keeping traction, or just plain old feeling noodly. 35 stanchion fork, I sometimes just feel like it's not enough. Although it's an e-bike specific fork, it just feels like if you really push this bike to what the geometry would kind of suggest, you're gonna overdo the fork. I don't really have a problem with the fork not having a ton of adjustment. That's not the issue. It's just, it's probably not built big enough to handle some hard riding on this bike. That's where I felt my confidence lacking. This fork doesn't feel like it's set up to do what I want it to do. In the back, we have a Rockshox Deluxe Select shock with 150 millimeters of travel. I actually love this shock. It's interesting. It just seems like it's a great fit for this bike. It's a pretty no-nonsense shock. There's not a ton of adjustability. It's not a super high-end shock. It feels great. It's smooth. It feels plush off the top. It also has always felt like there's enough shock there for me, even though it's 150 millimeter and there's 160 up front. I felt like the shock was better equipped to handle chunkier terrain and more aggressive riding than the fork was. For what it's worth, I love this shock. I don't love the fork. That's what I feel about the suspension. Drivetrain is Sram NX Eagle. We also do have 160 millimeter cranks. Overall, NX Eagle, it could be better. I have had the NX Eagle on the Spire as well. I know it's not the lightest, it's not the most reliable, could be at risk to wearing out your components faster. In my experience though, acknowledging those risks, I've had no issues with it. I've had no issues with the NX on my Spire. I'm totally fine with this setup with this drivetrain. It's also fairly cheap and easy to replace if the time comes. Probably have a few comments down there saying that, hey, that's gonna wear out in 6 months, because there's always someone who feels that way. Maybe you've had NX drivetrain wear out and you're still a little hurt by that. With an e-bike, my mentality though is if I'm in a descending gear and there's also a climb, rather than mashing through gears real fast and just grinding everything, I bump up the e-bike assist. If you end up in a bad situation because you forgot to shift, just crank up the power and stay in that gear. That's my 2 cents with that. And then we have to talk about this. Oh, well, dropper post. Dropper post works fine. Not really any thoughts there. It works. The saddle. I really like Specialized saddles. If you're looking for them as well, just go to Goodwill and look for Specialized saddles. They're really nice. I have bought them at Goodwill for like $10 multiple times, and then buying a Specialized bike, I was like, oh great, I get to be on a Specialized saddle, and it delivered. It's great. Works fine. That's all I have to say about that. E-bike parts. Let's talk about this. Specialized Turbo Full Power System 2.2 Brose motor, 250 watts, Battery is a 500 watt hour battery. I was thoroughly impressed by this motor and this battery and the setup. I had plenty of battery life. I haven't done a full run it to death test. I have actually ran it to death once, but I was not doing Strava or tracking anything, whatever. But it was a huge day of riding, several hours in the cold before I actually, killed the battery there. The whole assembly is very quiet. I love the compartment that closes the charging port in. It's not just like a rubber flap. It actually has a clamp, a stopper, door that closes. So it's a really nice enclosure to keep all of that nice and dry. I have felt like this motor is very quiet as well. If I'm not cranking hard, I can sneak right up on people and they don't even hear or know that I'm on an e-bike. And pedaling with friends uphill too, I can't hear my motor, but I can hear other people's. The last thing I would say on that, there's sometimes like a weird crank rattling with a lot of different motors, and this one has none of that. This bike is completely silent, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. It's so quiet. The only thing I would say, besides the lack of having a screen, right? I just have a button to press and then bars that fill up. It tells you 1, 2, 3 what mode you're in. It lights up, I believe, 10 bars, and then they go out as you're running out of battery. Now, the hard thing about that is you can't see how many bars were lit. So you just kind of see them go away, but you can't tell like where the top originally was. It's just kind of hard to tell looking down there exactly what percentage you have left. And that's really my only complaint about the whole setup. Had a screen, it'd be better. And I do know some of the other models of the Levo do have screens. That, I would say, pretty much wraps it up. Overall, I'm very happy with this bike. I love the setup. I am going to be going through upgrades and the future of this bike on this channel. So if you want to hear about that, if you're interested in the Levo, if you have a Levo yourself, or if you're looking at buying one, subscribe, follow along, and until then, I'll catch you guys on the trails. Cheers.